Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named The Eternaut, Season 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins on a quiet summer night when a few young women are enjoying a carefree yacht vacation, the ocean glistening under the moonlight. Laughter echoes as they clink glasses, but in an instant, the sea is swallowed by pitch-black darkness, as though someone flipped off the world's light switch. Then, a strange, dazzling green light descends over the water. Drawn by the bizarre sight, the girls step out of the cabin to investigate. But the moment they do, a violent windstorm erupts from the previously calm sea. One of them rushes to the cockpit, hoping to raise the sails and regain control, but to her horror, every piece of electronic equipment has mysteriously shut down. Before she can react, two of her friends outside the cabin suddenly collapse. Shaking with fear, she peers through the window, just in time to see a single snowflake drifting down from the sky. Snow in the middle of summer, the sight only deepens the horror. Meanwhile, in a city in Argentina, a large-scale protest is in full swing. Angry citizens gather in front of City Hall, chanting and waving signs. 3 days ago, the entire city had inexplicably lost power. The blackout not only disrupted daily life, it also cut off access to clean water, as the low-lying city depends entirely on electric pumps. Furious at the inaction of city officials, residents flooded the streets, demanding the mayor's resignation. The demonstration had brought traffic to a standstill, forcing police to divert vehicles. Among the frustrated drivers was Juan, who had been on his way to a friend's gathering. Forced to take a detour, he barely had time to process what he saw. Several fire trucks racing past at full speed. Something didn't feel right, but he pushed the thought aside. Only when Juan arrived at the house did he learn what had happened. A fire had broken out at a city power substation, and the flames had spread to a nearby asbestos factory. That explained the blaring sirens all evening. Brushing off the news, Juan and the others entered the villa. Located in the city's wealthiest district, just one wall away from City Hall, the neighborhood was untouched by the blackout. Lights blazed, laughter filled the air. It felt like a world apart. Inside, the group played cards to pass the time. They were old friends, close and familiar. But their laughter came to an abrupt halt when the overhead light began to flicker. After a few flashes, it died completely. Then every single phone in the house powered off. Still, they assumed it was just a generator issue and remained in good spirits. That is, until a loud, eerie noise echoed from outside. Just then, the lady of the house hurried downstairs. She had just seen their neighbor collapse out of nowhere. Alarmed, her husband, Alfredo, moved to go outside and check on him, but before he could, Juan caught sight of something through the window. He found it was snowing. Everyone froze, thinking it couldn't be possible in the middle of a sweltering summer. Panic set in. Alfredo suddenly remembered a news story telling the snow could be toxic ash from the burning asbestos. Maybe their neighbor had inhaled it and passed out. The room fell into silence. No one dared step outside. Then came another deafening crash. Through the window, they saw a car veer off the road and slam into the curb. One of them instinctively reached for a phone to call family, only to remember the phones were all dead. Even the landline didn't work. Thankfully, Alfredo kept his wits about him. He quickly ordered everyone to shut and seal the windows and doors, hoping to keep any harmful gases out. He then urged them all to head upstairs and rest. But Juan hesitated. He placed his hand against the glass, and a biting chill shot up his arm. It was snowing, and the unease in his heart began to grow. Then one of their card-playing friends became increasingly restless. He had a daughter at home, and the anxiety gnawed at his sanity. Ignoring everyone's warnings, he grabbed a coat, threw it over his head, and bolted for the door. He made it only a few steps before collapsing to the ground, like a puppet with its strings cut. After a brief, pitiful struggle, he lay motionless. The last sliver of hope shattered. Time crawled on under a blanket of dread. The entire city was slowly being consumed by this cursed snow. The few still standing inside the house stared at one another, their faces pale with despair. But just when all seemed lost, a sudden knocking echoed from the basement below. The sound was strange, almost unnatural, but to the terrified survivors, it was a spark of hope in a world gone cold. They quickly grabbed oil lamps and candles, cautiously making their way downstairs to investigate. The noise was coming from an old door that led to the garage, and to their surprise, someone was frantically shouting for help on the other side. The group rushed to open the door, but Alfredo hesitated, a troubled look on his face. He admitted that the door hadn't been used in years, and he no longer remembered where the key was, but the others refused to give up that easily. After a brief discussion, they decided to force the door open. The moment they pried it loose, a soaking wet food delivery woman stumbled inside. Shivering and visibly shaken, she began to recount her story as Juan and the others bombarded her with questions. Just moments earlier, she had taken shelter in the garage to fix her broken-down scooter when she witnessed someone collapse in the toxic snow. In a panic, she banged on the door for help, caring about nothing else. As soon as she finished, Juan's eyes lit up. He immediately stepped outside and followed the narrow path to the parking lot, where his car sat not far away, though the keys were still inside the security office. Prompted by Alfredo's concerned questions, Juan admitted he wanted to try retrieving the keys. Although the strange snow continued to fall, the delivery woman appeared completely unharmed. Juan reasoned that as long as bare skin didn't come into direct contact with the toxic flakes, there might not be any immediate danger. Ignoring Alfredo's pleas, he made up his mind to take the risk. With help from his friends, they managed to push a truck up against the security office. Juan quickly set up a ladder, wrapped a plastic bag around his head, and carefully climbed into the office. When he emerged holding the keys to his and his friends' cars, everyone exhaled in relief. For the first time, it felt like there was a real chance of escape. But just as Juan tried to start his car, the engine wouldn't respond. Nothing happened. That was when the group realized the disaster was far worse than they had imagined. The power outage and dead phones hadn't been mere coincidences. Something had rendered all electronics useless, and the only events capable of such widespread damage were either a massive solar storm or a devastating nuclear explosion. As dread settled over them, they noticed lights flicker on in the house across the street. Morning had come. An elderly man stepped up to the window and the group panicked. They waved their lighters frantically, trying to warn him not to open it. But their gestures only piqued his curiosity. They could do nothing but watch in horror as he unlatched the window, only to instantly collapse onto the windowsill. Moments later, an elderly woman who rushed over suffered the same fate. Two twisted corpses now lay slumped on the sill as snowflakes swirled through the open window. Juan's expression darkened. He thought of his daughter, Clara, who usually left early to go to her club. The thought of her out there pushed him to the brink. He made a move for the door, determined to bring her home. Thankfully, the others held him back. But Juan was resolute. He insisted he had to reach home before sunrise. Realizing there was no changing his mind, his friends helped him gear up. Alfredo even brought out his last remaining waterproof suit. They fitted Juan with a gas mask and carefully sealed every part of his body to prevent contact with the toxic snow. Wrapped tightly in protective gear, Juan stepped out the door as his friends watched anxiously. The icy wind and snow lashed against him, but the gas mask and waterproof suit kept him safe. Still, the scene outside was harrowing. Bodies lay scattered across the snow-covered streets. Even the driver involved in last night's crash hadn't survived. The city was eerily silent, like a massive graveyard. The sheer emptiness filled Juan with overwhelming sorrow. He kept walking, not daring to stop, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him through the veil of falling snow. A chill ran down his spine all the way to his smelly butt. His mind went blank, and he suddenly turned and broke into a run, his breath fogging up the inside of his mask. Only after calming down and recovering from the cold did the dread in his chest begin to ease. Juan pulled out a folded map from his bag, planning a shortcut to his daughter's apartment. As he carefully passed through the train station, a chilling sight stopped him in his tracks. A motionless train stood on the tracks like a dying beast, its exterior surrounded by a sea of corpses, commuters frozen in twisted, contorted poses, as if each body was still reliving the moment the catastrophe struck without warning. After standing frozen in shock for a moment, Juan quickly pushed through the blizzard and ran toward the train. Just when he thought everyone on board was dead, a faint sound of someone pounding on a window reached his ears. Through the frost-covered glass, Juan saw a dimly lit carriage filled with survivors. Their hopeful eyes locked on him, mistaking him for a rescue worker or firefighter. Without a word, Juan climbed aboard. The passengers, visibly shaken, spoke with choked voices, relieved, desperate. They'd been trapped for over 6 hours, cold and parched, but despite their pleas, Juan could only shake his head helplessly. He didn't have the means to save them. All he could do was pull out a large bottle of water from his backpack and leave it behind before turning away, his heart heavy and trudging back into the storm. No one knew how long he walked, but eventually Juan arrived, exhausted and nearly frozen, at the base of his estranged wife Elena's apartment building. His daughter Clara had lived with her ever since the couple separated. Carefully, he stepped into the building's dark, damp stairwell, took off his protective mask, shook the snow off his backpack, and began climbing the slick stairs, his breath ragged. As he passed a hallway, he saw a few survivors trying to pry open the door of a vacant apartment using tools. He kept his distance and crept past quietly. When he reached Elena's floor, he noticed several people standing solemnly at her door, candlelight flickering around them as they chanted softly, seeking some kind of spiritual comfort in the midst of the apocalypse. Ignoring them, Juan rushed into the apartment. He searched every room meticulously but found no sign of Elena or Clara. A chill ran up his spine to his butt. Panic swelled like a tide, threatening to drown him. Just then, heavy footsteps echoed from the living room. Desperate, Juan burst out of the room and tackled the man who'd entered, pinning him to the ground. He assumed the stranger was a looter, but the man quickly explained that Elena had asked him to retrieve some medicine from the apartment. Two neighbors then stepped in to vouch for him. Juan's demeanor softened, but then he noticed snowflakes stuck to his clothing. Strangely, he felt no physical discomfort. Before he could dwell on it, Elena entered the apartment. Her expression was complicated as she quietly ushered the neighbors out. When Juan asked about Clara, Elena explained that their daughter had gone to a friend's house the night before and hadn't returned. Worse still, Elena had no idea where that friend lived. Juan took a deep breath and forced himself to stay calm. After thinking for a moment, he decided to head to Clara's school, hoping it might have a record of student addresses. But just as he opened the front door, he was blocked by several neighbors waiting outside. They were full of questions, wondering how Juan had made it here safely and if his body was somehow immune to the toxic snow. Juan, weary and out of patience, explained that he'd worn a gas mask and waterproof suit. As long as the snow didn't touch bare skin, it lost its potency. Still, suspicion lingered in their eyes. Then a bald man stepped forward to flex his bald head and demanded that Juan hand over his gas mask to cover his bald head. The residents had run out of clean water days ago and desperately needed to venture outside for supplies. The stairwell was now packed with people blocking the exit. Feigning compliance, Juan crouched down as if reaching for the mask in his bag, but instead he pulled out a pistol. At the sight of the weapon, the crowd backed off like frightened chicken. No one dared challenge him. Seizing the moment, Juan grabbed Elena's hand and bolted down the stairs, but the bald man had a bald gun too, and he opened fire at their fleeing silhouettes. Chaos erupted in the stairwell. Fortunately, the couple managed to evade the bullets and duck into an empty apartment. They barricaded the door with a heavy wardrobe. Gasping for breath, Juan told Elena to find a waterproof coat. Then, peering out the window like a peeping Tom, he spotted a delivery truck parked below, an idea forming in his mind. But just then, the bald man and his followers tracked them down. Angry voices and pounding fists thundered outside the door. With no time to lose, Juan helped Elena into the waterproof suit and placed the only gas mask on her face. He guided her to the window, telling her to jump onto the truck's roof below. He urged her to go find Clara while he would hold them off, and with that, he stayed behind, ready to face whatever came next. By the time the people outside finally broke down the door, Juan decided he had nothing left to lose. With one swift motion, he smashed the living room window. As snowflakes came swirling into the room, the bald man and his crew panicked and scattered like bald chickens, fleeing for their shitty lives. Fortunately, Juan had quickly covered his face with a plastic bag, shielding himself from the toxic snow. He then repeated his earlier trick, wrapping himself tightly in the plastic and leaping out the window onto the truck roof below. At last, he had escaped the building, but the strain of the escape caught up with him. Gasping for air, Juan stumbled a few more steps before collapsing in the snow. When he finally regained consciousness, he found himself in a rattling vehicle, surrounded by several figures bundled up in heavy clothing. As his vision cleared, he recognized their faces. It was Elena and some of his old friends. Relief and exhaustion hit him all at once, and for the first time in days, Juan exhaled in peace. As it turned out, shortly after Juan left, Alfredo's wife had gone to pour herself a cup of tea, but Alfredo sternly stopped her. No one could be sure if the tap water had been contaminated by the poisonous snowfall. Out of caution, they had resolved to use only bottled water, but the remaining supply would barely last a few days. Still, they had faith in Juan. If he returned in time, they could all suit up in protective gear and venture out for essential supplies. Alfredo, ever the pragmatist, understood that in a world descending into chaos, the darkest sides of human nature would surface. While waiting, he reinforced the doors and windows and gathered whatever weapons they had for self-defense. The food delivery girl, watching all this unfold, grew curious and reached out to touch one of the makeshift weapons, only to meet a room full of suspicious guarded stares. Treated like a thief, she pulled on her helmet angrily and turned to leave. Alfredo rushed to stop her sexy body. Cautious though he was, he couldn't bear to watch someone walk knowingly into danger. Seeing she was determined to go, he offered to at least repair her faulty delivery bike to give her a fighting chance. While working on the bike, Alfredo made a surprising discovery. The light still worked. Upon closer inspection, he realized the new LED bulb had burned out, but the old tungsten filament light was still intact. That gave him an idea. He quickly rigged the record player to the car battery with a few wires, and moments later, the sound of music filled the house. In that instant, they all realized something important. The electromagnetic pulse from the disaster had only affected devices with integrated circuits. Old-school electronics still worked. With renewed hope, the group worked together to revive Alfredo's long-abandoned classic car. Once it roared to life, they drove straight to the nearest fire station, each picking up a full set of protective firefighting gear. By what felt like fate, they then managed to rescue Juan and Elena just in time. But no one noticed the fireballs streaking down from the sky as they drove past a lifeless neighborhood. What fresh disaster was about to unfold? The icy wind howled through the ruined streets, carrying toxic snow as it went. After hours of bone-rattling travel, Juan and the others finally returned to Alfredo's place, battered but alive. They gathered around an old radio, trying to make contact with the outside world, but all they got was a loud, grating burst of static. Frowns spread across the room. Someone finally spoke up, suggesting they abandon the city and head somewhere safer. But the idea was quickly shot down. There was no telling whether other places were any better. The unknown outside felt just as dangerous. Juan was especially against it. His daughter was still missing. After a long silence, he asked Alfredo if he could borrow the classic car, but Alfredo firmly refused. That car was their lifeline, one of the few working vehicles left. Left with no other option, Juan and Elena set out on foot toward their daughter's school. The blizzard worsened. Alfredo's earlier fears began to come true. That night, as darkness fell, lawlessness took over. Glass shattered in the streets, accompanied by the sporadic crack of gunfire. Morality had collapsed. Meanwhile, Juan and Elena leaned on each other through the storm. By early morning, they finally reached the school, only to find devastation. The eerie silence was broken only by the crunch of snow beneath their feet and the sight of lifeless bodies scattered across the campus. They decided to split up. Juan would look for a usable vehicle, while Elena would search the office for contact info for Clara's classmates. But as Juan entered the security booth, something strange happened. A vision flashed in his mind. Clara, sleeping peacefully while outside the bell tower, was engulfed in flames before collapsing in on itself. He snapped back to reality, heart racing, only to realize he was already sitting in a vehicle. On instinct, he twisted the key, and miraculously, the engine started. Back inside the school, Elena crept down the corridor with a fire axe in hand. Her eyes took in the carnage outside the windows, student bodies strewn like broken dolls. Her chest tightened with grief. Then came a faint knock. She followed the sound to a bathroom at the far end of the hall. Peering through a vent above the door, she met a pair of wild, angry eyes staring back at her. A barrage of curses rang out from inside. Luckily, Juan arrived just in time. He pried open the bathroom stall and pulled out the frightened student who'd been locked inside for days. Without warning, Juan smacked the boy across the face, not out of cruelty, but to snap him out of panic. After some questioning, they learned the boy's classmates had locked him in there as a prank 2 whole days ago, and then never came back. Seeing that the boy was still agitated, Juan spoke to him in a heavy tone. He explained that the reason no one had come to open the bathroom door was likely because all of his classmates were already dead. The boy's face froze in disbelief. He shoved Juan aside and ran to the window. Outside, the frozen bodies of his classmates lay scattered across the snow. His whole body trembled, and tears streamed uncontrollably down his face. Elena, heart aching at the sight, hurried over and wrapped a coat around his shoulders. Then she pulled out a class photo of their daughter's homeroom, but the boy shook his head. He didn't recognize Clara. However, he did recognize the girl standing next to her. Her name was Lori. In that moment, hope flared in Juan and Elena's eyes. That name, Lori, was the classmate Clara had mentioned the night before. With the boy leading the way, they made their way to what he claimed was Lori's house. After knocking repeatedly with no response, Juan kicked down the door. He and Elena searched every room, only to find the house completely empty. It wasn't until they stepped out into the backyard that they stumbled upon a horrifying sight. Several corpses lay crumpled around a dining table, their bodies blanketed in poisonous snow. Juan rushed over, his hands trembling as he gently lifted the head of one of the girls. When he saw it wasn't Clara, a sliver of relief passed through him. But before he could breathe, the boy let out a heart-wrenching scream. The truth shattered everything. The boy had been lying. This wasn't Lori's house. It was his, and the people frozen at the table were his family. Grief-stricken, the boy tried to throw himself into the snowstorm. Juan and Elena had no choice but to drag him back to the car. At first, they considered leaving him behind, but when they realized he was burning with a high fever, Elena, ever the mother, refused to abandon him. Later, as they passed by a pharmacy, the couple stopped to search for fever medicine. Just as they were about to leave, someone began banging urgently on the front door. They looked up to see a pregnant woman pleading for help. Elena, driven by compassion, opened the door without hesitation and welcomed her in. But as soon as the woman sat down, her expression shifted. An eerie smile stretched across her greasy face. A moment later, a man with a gun slipped in through the side entrance and pointed the weapon straight at Juan and Elena. The ambush happened too fast. They had no choice but to hand over the car keys and allow themselves to be herded into the restroom at gunpoint. Thankfully, the unconscious boy remained hidden and unnoticed. After the robbers left, the boy finally came to. With Elena's gentle encouragement, he helped unlock the door, freeing them. But now, without a car, they had no choice but to continue on foot through the raging blizzard. As they trudged through the snow, Juan made a chilling discovery. The bodies that once littered the landscape were gone. Alarmed, he pushed through a torn section of fencing and made his way to the railroad tracks they had passed earlier. But what he found there only deepened the dread. The entire train station was eerily empty. No bodies, no survivors, nothing. Yet the red message still scrawled across the train windows confirmed it was the same train. A wave of unease swept over Juan. The mangled seats, twisted metal, and claw-like gouges on the train's frame. These weren't marks left by human hands. It was as if something unnatural had torn through the place. An icy chill crept up his spine to his smelly butt. Without looking back, he urged Elena and the boy forward, believing that it was best not to find out whatever had happened here. Who knew how much time passed before they finally stumbled, exhausted, back to Alfredo's house. But instead of relief, they were met with confusion. Everyone inside was packing up. Juan looked at Alfredo, bewildered, but Alfredo didn't hide the truth. He explained that he'd received a radio transmission from Brazil confirming the worst. The poisonous snow was a global catastrophe. Rescue wasn't coming, not anytime soon. Alfredo then pulled out a compass and handed it to Juan. To their astonishment, the needle spun aimlessly. It seemed Earth's magnetic field was collapsing. This disaster was far more than just weather. It was something deeper, something apocalyptic. After careful thought, Alfredo made a decision. He owned a property on a remote island out at sea, and he intended to lead everyone there and turn it into a shelter. But Juan didn't hesitate. He refused. Not until he found Clara. He wouldn't leave the city without her. That night, the couple who had robbed Juan and Elena reached a gas station. The man, irritated, got out to refuel while the woman sat in the car, humming casually. But then, rustling sounds came from the darkness. The man raised his flashlight toward the noise, alert. The woman, growing impatient, stuck her head out the window to see what was going on. Then, boom! A loud crash outside shook the car. Startled, the woman barely had time to react before a massive, terrifying shadow slammed into the vehicle. The car skidded violently across the snow. She screamed in terror, her voice cutting through the night. Seconds later, the vehicle tumbled off the edge of a ravine, and everything fell silent. At dawn, Alfredo and the others were still packing supplies for their island escape. Meanwhile, Juan stepped alone into the blizzard once again, beginning his search for Clara. He'd found Lori's full address in Clara's discarded phone book. No matter what, he had to know, whether his daughter was alive or dead. Just then, the roar of an engine came from behind. Alfredo pulled up in his car. Though he didn't agree with Juan's plan, their years of friendship meant more than any argument. He decided to help Juan find his daughter first, then take everyone to the island. As a physicist specializing in applied sciences, Alfredo had spent the past few days analyzing the situation. He'd finally developed a theory. Earth's magnetic poles once acted like an invisible shield, protecting the planet from cosmic radiation. But now, with that magnetic shield collapsing, radioactive particles from space had begun to cling to snow crystals, transforming snowfall into a lethal radioactive poison. The two men chatted as they drove, but their conversation was suddenly cut short by the engine stalling. Ahead of them, an overpass was completely blocked. Abandoned vehicles were stacked like the skeletal remains of giant beasts, sealing the road off entirely. Stunned, Juan and Alfredo stepped out of the car to get a closer look. Juan climbed up the mountain of metal, but as he examined the twisted wreckage, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The way these cars were mangled and piled, it couldn't have been caused by humans. Just then, Alfredo called out from below, his voice tense. Juan scrambled back down and followed Alfredo behind a vehicle for cover. Moments later, several military trucks with headlights blazing burst through the snowy fog, roaring toward them. One of the trucks skidded to a stop in front of them, and a soldier stepped out to inform them that the military was coordinating rescue operations in the area. They were strongly advised not to wander around. When the soldier learned that Juan was trying to get to the other side of the overpass, his tone grew stern. He said the area had been fully sealed off, and there was no chance it would reopen anytime soon. They were told to go home and wait for further instructions. With that, the convoy drove off into the mist. But something about it all felt off to Juan. He and Alfredo decided to keep a safe distance and quietly follow the convoy. As they tailed the trucks into a shadowy tunnel, the entire line of military vehicles suddenly slammed on their brakes. Juan instinctively wanted to step on the gas and see what was happening ahead, but before he could act, the soldiers opened fire. Alfredo assumed they were firing a warning and quickly threw the car into reverse. But to their shock, the bullets weren't aimed at them. They were shooting at something on the overpass. The next moment, a rusted-out bus came crashing down from above and smashed into the ground in front of them. Alfredo swerved hard, trying to escape, but just as he rounded a corner, a dark, hulking shadow flashed past their headlights. Panicked, he jerked the wheel, sending the car crashing through a barrier and plunging into an auto repair shop by the roadside. In that chaotic instant, Juan once again had a vision, his daughter sound asleep and the burning clock tower collapsing in flames. When he finally came to, his surroundings were clearer, and for the first time, he saw what the soldiers had been fighting. Enormous, mutilated creatures were bursting from the ground. They looked like monstrous beetles, grotesque and terrifying, moving with alarming speed. They swarmed the soldiers, spewing writhing GPS tendrils from their grotesque mouths, wrapping the men like cocooned prey. Horrified, Juan and Alfredo bolted up to the second floor of the repair shop, but even as they ran, the vision in Juan's mind grew sharper, and then everything went black. When he regained consciousness, Alfredo had already dragged him to the top floor, and the two of them were now crouched in a corner, not daring to make a sound. Only when the sounds of fighting below finally faded did they tiptoe out to take a look. What they saw was eerie. There wasn't a single corpse left in the snow. Only scattered guns and equipment remained. They hurried downstairs, grabbing a rifle on the way, and resumed their search. But just as they turned the next corner, they were stunned to find a massive, beetle-like creature dragging a soldier's body wrapped in web-like silk. The thing quickly disappeared into a hidden burrow. Eyes wide with terror, the two men silently agreed. They needed to get out of this place, fast. But just then, Alfredo slipped and slammed into a shipping container, the loud crash echoing through the silent street. A moment later, one of the creatures emerged from the hole. Without hesitation, Juan opened fire. The bullets clinked uselessly off the creature's armored shell, barely leaving a scratch. But Juan kept his cool. On the next shot, he aimed for the soft, unarmored head. The bullet hit true. The monster let out a hideous screech and collapsed. Before they could even catch their breath, the ground beneath them began to quake. From the tunnel, wave after wave of the monstrous insects came pouring out. Juan managed to shoot down another, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Just as all seemed lost, a human figure appeared in the distance, waving frantically at them to follow. Even more bizarre, the monsters had stopped attacking and were now devouring their own dead. Seizing the moment, Juan and Alfredo sprinted after the mysterious figure, racing across the snowy streets. Finally, they reached a towering clock tower. Someone above tossed down several Molotov cocktails, creating a wall of fire that pushed the beetles back. Juan and Alfredo slipped through a side entrance and scrambled up a narrow spiral staircase. As the first floor was overrun by the creatures, they followed their rescuer into a hidden chamber. To their surprise, warmth and firelight greeted them. Inside, huddled around the flames, were more than a dozen survivors. Some looked at the newcomers with wary eyes, others offered them a seat and a bit of rest. Scanning the room, Juan finally asked what those monsters were and where they came from. The group fell silent. Then someone pointed upward, saying they came from the sky. Juan frowned, confused, but a moment later a survivor led him up a rusted iron ladder to the rooftop. From there, the sky came into view, and with it, the truth. Several fireballs streaked across the heavens, trailing smoke as they tore through the clouds like omens of the apocalypse. And at that moment, Juan realized the toxic snowfall was only the beginning. This was not a natural disaster, it was the vanguard of an alien invasion. As night fell, the atmosphere among the survivors grew increasingly tense. Scarlet fireballs streaked across the sky, and massive insects crawled through the streets in endless waves, forming a black tide that surged through the city. Realizing that even the clock tower was no longer safe, the group gathered to discuss whether they should evacuate, but consensus proved elusive. Juan, knowing that every second of delay further diminished the chance of finding his daughter alive, joined those trying to persuade the others. Eventually, most survivors agreed to take the risk and relocate, except for 2 who were badly injured. Not wanting to drag the others down, they chose to stay behind in the church. Taking advantage of a brief moment when the swarm retreated to their nest, Juan carefully led over a dozen survivors through the church doors. They held their breath as they passed through debris-strewn streets, hoping to reach a military shelter and find help. But just as they reached the underpass and were preparing to cross through a hidden tunnel, the nightmare returned. A chilling rustle echoed from the distance, and the giant insects burst from the ground in a feeding frenzy, surging forward like a black tide. Panic erupted as the survivors scattered, eventually cramming into a narrow crevice for cover. Juan, however, was trapped in an abandoned bus while helping a mother and child. He quietly urged them not to make a sound, but hadn't counted on the creature's unnaturally sharp senses. Soon, one of them caught their scent and approached. Just as the creature closed in, a sudden peal of a bell rang out across the night. The 2 injured survivors, still in the clock tower, had summoned the last of their strength to ring the emergency bell, drawing the swarm away from the bus. The insects turned en masse, stampeding toward the tower, giving Juan and the others a narrow chance to escape. Meanwhile, inside the clock tower, the 2 remaining survivors stood unfazed as the horde stormed in. The older of the 2 dropped his lit cigarette onto the floor. In an instant, flames engulfed the building. Back on the street, Juan discovered a pickup truck buried under rubble, and to his astonishment, it still worked. Just as the group was pushing the vehicle free, the noise alerted another wave of creatures. One of the beetles slammed Juan to the ground, but Alfredo and the others leapt into action, pulling him back just in time. The group piled into the truck and sped off, hoping to find nearby military forces. But the insects were relentless. A giant billboard was shoved off the overpass, revealing a swarm waiting behind it. Juan floored the gas, weaving past wreckage, and finally outpaced the pursuing horde. As the burning tower disappeared in the rearview mirror, a deep sorrow settled in their hearts. But there was no time to mourn. They needed to find safety, fast. At that moment, the strange visions in Juan's mind returned, more vivid than ever. A crushing sense of dread washed over him. Upon hearing the others plan to head for the military base, Juan instinctively resisted. Something about that place felt wrong, dangerous even. Using the excuse of searching for his daughter, he and Alfredo broke away from the group and raced back to their temporary shelter. What they didn't expect was what they found upon arriving. Juan's daughter, Clara, fast asleep in his wife's arms. He had no idea how she had gotten there, but it didn't matter. She was safe. That was all that counted. The weight in his chest finally lifted. Juan quickly warned everyone about the insect outbreak downtown and predicted it wouldn't be long before the infestation spread beyond the overpass. The group agreed without hesitation. They had to leave, but there was only one vehicle, nowhere near enough room for everyone. Just then, a neighbor showed up. He had come to invite Alfredo and the others to join a local militia forming to defend the area. But after hearing their plan to evacuate, the man handed over a spare set of keys and offered them his old RV. In return, he asked Alfredo to hand over the house he'd prepared as a militia base. Though Alfredo was reluctant to part with it, he knew staying behind meant certain death. In the end, he agreed to the trade. At dawn, the 2 vehicles set off on schedule. Neighbors lined the streets, waving them off with blessings and goodbyes. No one knew that an even greater danger awaited them ahead. Alfredo's plan was to reach the pier and continue the journey by water. But when they arrived, their hearts sank. The once vast sea had vanished, replaced by cracked black sludge. Countless boats lay stranded in the dried-up riverbed like beached whales. The dream of reaching the island was shattered. With no other choice, the group turned the convoy around and headed toward the only option left, the military outpost across the sea bridge. Along the road, abandoned vehicles lay buried under thick snow, their frozen shells casting a heavy silence over the group's mood. Suddenly, a column of black smoke rising in the distance caught everyone's attention. As they approached cautiously, they discovered a car flipped on its side by the roadside, its driver's helmet riddled with bullet holes. It was clear these people hadn't died from the toxic snow or the insect swarms, but had been shot by human hands. The grim realization weighed on them even more heavily. In this end-of-the-world nightmare, the moral bottom line had utterly collapsed. Yet amidst the gloom, there was a spark of hope. Clara, finally awake from her deep sleep, but something was off. She couldn't remember how she had ended up at Alfredo's place. The group exchanged uneasy looks, but the long journey had left no time for deep reflection. Soon, they arrived at a survivor camp. After some discussion, they decided to rest there for the night. Fortunately, supplies were still sufficient, and after a hearty meal, everyone found a patch of ground to settle on and drifted off to sleep. Early the next morning, Juan was awakened by the growing noise. Survivors were rushing toward the camp's exit. Sensing something urgent, he quickly roused the others. When they followed the crowd outside, they were stunned. The relentless, toxic snowstorm had finally stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the ground below. Overcome with relief, everyone poured out of the camp, their cheers ringing loud and clear into the sky. For a moment, it seemed the nightmare was over, but Alfredo was wary. Pulling out his compass, he saw the magnetic poles had completely reversed. The crisis was far from over. Unknown dangers still awaited them. Before they could process this unsettling truth, a car screeched to a halt outside the camp gates. 3 strangers jumped out and without a word began firing wildly into the crowd. Panic erupted as survivors scattered in all directions. When Juan learned his daughter was still outside, he immediately grabbed a gun and snapped into battle mode. Working with a few others, he managed to pick off 2 of the attackers, but the third slipped away in the chaos. Removing the mask from one of the dead assailants, Juan's blood ran cold. It was a gaunt woman wearing a child's pendant around her neck. Even more disturbing, Juan remembered seeing her in a mall before the disaster, buying a gift for a child, but muttering strange words under her breath. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it, but now, a chilling question gnawed at him. What could drive a mother to attack innocent survivors? Before he could unravel this mystery, distant engine roars filled the air. Military vehicles rolled in and came to a slow stop. The commanding officer announced the base was fully stocked with supplies, urging survivors to board the trucks. Hopeful, the group climbed aboard without hesitation, unaware that the fleeing attacker had returned. The man swaggered into the nearby sewer, and astonishingly, the insect creatures inhabiting the tunnels parted to let him pass unchallenged. It seems that some dark secrets lay behind the insect invasion. Meanwhile, Juan and the others had safely reached the military camp. As promised, life inside was peaceful enough. Many young survivors volunteered for training, determined to build strength against the insects. Most women were assigned to medical teams, caring for wounded soldiers and survivors. Juan and Alfredo, both veterans, were assigned to the patrol unit. But no sooner had Alfredo joined than he was called into the command center. The top officer, having learned Alfredo was a former communications specialist skilled with electronics, asked him to repair a radio device. Alfredo's conflicted expression betrayed his reluctance. Later, Juan overheard a heated argument between 2 friends in the camp square. The military planned to install a communications transmitter downtown, hoping to gather more survivors there. But everyone knew the city center was far too dangerous. Although success could save thousands, Alfredo remained torn. At that moment, new survivors arrived at the camp, none other than the elderly neighbor who had lent them the RV. Grimly, the neighbor informed them that the self-defense militia had been wiped out in battle with the insects, leaving him the sole survivor. The weight of this news pressed heavily on Alfredo's heart. That night, 2 of the survivors who'd escaped the clock tower with Juan slipped quietly through the camp and pulled him aside. They'd fought side by side before, and now they urged him to join the team that was going to build the communications array. One of them confessed he used to drive trains and could get them all straight into downtown once the tracks were reactivated. After a long night of deliberation, even Alfredo agreed to take on the mission. At first light the next morning, 20 volunteers, each saying a quick goodbye to their families, climbed into an inflatable assault boat and drifted downriver. From there, they crept toward the old train station. High overhead, fighter jets ripped through the clouds, and hope blazed in their eyes. The military wasn't just holding the line, it was mounting a counterattack. Following the rusted tracks, they soon came upon an abandoned locomotive. Their captain split the group at once. A handful would fan out around the station as lookouts, while the rest began work retrofitting the engine. Sparks flew and hatches clanged until finally the train was ready. The volunteers clambered aboard, fired up the boiler, and rumbled east toward the city center, unaware that, from the water tower rooftop far off, a rifle-toting woman watched them go. As the train barreled onward, they ran square into a blockade of derelict cars, each one crawling with hundreds of ravenous bugs. But they were prepared. Strapping themselves in with safety ropes, they cranked the throttle to max and rammed the wreckage at full speed. Shards of twisted metal flew like shrapnel as fire and smoke exploded around them, carving a narrow gap through the tangle of cars. When the dust cleared, the tracks lay open once more. Cheers erupted in the carriage. Their victory was short-lived. A few hundred meters from the central plaza, the rails simply ended. With no alternative, the volunteers gathered their gear and set off on foot. The hike into the heart of the city was eerily uneventful. At last, they reached their destination, a towering office building where the array was to be installed. The captain divided the 20 into 3 teams. The technical squad lugged equipment up to the rooftop to erect the transmitter. A fire team stayed below, hammering together barricades from rubble, and a 4-man recon unit was dispatched to investigate the mysterious bomber crash they'd passed earlier. If insects couldn't fly, what had shot that plane out of the sky? They threaded through silent streets, yet found no sign of giant bugs. The silence only deepened Juan's unease. Perhaps the swarm was setting a trap. Meanwhile, the recon team reached the bombed-out sports arena and discovered it was a Peruvian bomber, its fuselage still stocked with high-explosive ordnance. Oddly, the plane's target had been a rundown gymnasium. Before they could piece it together, armed survivors emerged from the shadows and surrounded them. Back at camp, Alfredo and the tech team had finished assembling the transmitter. The first broadcast crackled to life over the airwaves, urging fellow survivors to make for the military shelter. Families wept with relief as they heard the signal. Satisfied it was working, the tech squad set the unit to loop the message, then began packing up to leave. That's when a strange, pulsating blue glow appeared from the direction of the sports arena. Juan's heart sank. He was certain it marked an insect hive. He rushed to the commanding officer to demand a squad be sent to investigate. The officer's brow furrowed. The recon team hadn't returned yet, he reminded Juan, and it would be reckless to send anyone else. So they waited. Late that night, Juan and his friends gathered around a battered table to play cards. But one friend kept fumbling his hand, his eyes darting nervously. Before anyone could ask what was wrong, the friend slammed his fist on the table, snatched up a knife, and stabbed the man beside him. Then he sprinted for the stairwell. Juan chased him all the way to the rooftop's edge and caught him just as the blue glow outside pulsed brighter than ever. The friend whispered that his mission was complete, and without another word, hurled himself off the roof. The real horror had only just begun. A surging horde of survivors flooded into the camp, clamoring at the gates. Just then, a patrol of soldiers returned. Juan and Alfredo ran to flag them down, but the lead trooper shouted an alarm. The fleeing crowd saw the soldiers and started chasing them instead. Juan drew his pistol, firing warning shots as he and Alfredo and the remaining volunteers raced back to the retrofitted train. Only 5 of the original 20 made it. As the engine roared to life, Juan turned to Alfredo. He suggested they split up here. Some go back to the camp and report in, while Juan and Alfredo head straight back to that stadium to find out exactly what the bugs are planning. And with that, they thundered off into the night once more. Not long after, the 2 of them arrived on the rooftop of a tall building next to the sports complex. The scene before them made their hearts skip a beat. In the center of the stadium, a large crowd of survivors had gathered, blank stares, expressionless faces. What shocked Juan even more was the presence of his own daughter among them. Mixed in with the survivors were countless insect-like creatures. Juan's eyes were drawn to a pavilion glowing with an eerie blue light. Suddenly, a flood of memories stirred within him. This scene felt hauntingly familiar. He had a chilling premonition that the true enemy was about to reveal itself. Then, from the blue glow, a gigantic hand covered with finger-like appendages emerged. It made several gestures, and some of the survivors, as if receiving a signal, turned into mindless drones and shuffled away obediently, while the rest continued to stare fixedly at the blue light. At that moment, Juan finally understood the warnings buried deep in his memory. The insect swarm was merely bait dropped by an alien civilization. They sealed off the city and spread panic. But the real danger was the mental control that could infiltrate and manipulate human consciousness. Even the so-called military safe haven was a trap set by these aliens. They controlled the minds of the military leaders and lured survivors here to become puppets, allowing the extraterrestrials to seize Earth with ease. Among the earliest humans to be mentally manipulated were Juan's daughter and friend. All the fragmented memories clicked into place. Juan finally remembered who he truly was. He was not an ordinary survivor, but the legendary Eternaut, a traveler capable of crossing time and space. Through countless jumps, he had been trying to correct the history altered by the alien civilization. With the clearing operation now complete, the real alien invasion was about to begin. The question remains, will Juan's plan to save Earth succeed this time? Can humanity truly escape this catastrophe? We will find that answer in Season 2 of this drama. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.